and I'm the archivist at Queer History Boston, and I'm very excited to introduce our panelists today. We are down one panelist due to illness, but I'm excited to introduce Angela and Micha. So Angela Tate is Chief Curator and Director of Collections at the Museum of African American History, where she oversees curatorial vision, collection stewardship, and interpretive strategy across historic sites. A historian and curator, her work centers Black women's archives, sound, and performance, with particular attention to how voice, listening, and media shape political consciousness. She is the lead curator of Black Voices of the Revolution, which opened in July 2025, an exhibition foregrounding Black sonic and political life in the age of revolution. Her practice bridges museums, scholarship, and public dialogue, making her work especially resonant in film-based conversations about history, memory, and representation. Micha Broadnax is a memory worker and archival strategist with experience improving access to information in academic, community, and personal repositories. Inspired by Black feminist imaginations and space-making, she pursued the library profession to explore archiving as a practice of care and community building. They are the project manager for the Black Teacher Archive based at Harvard and the audiovisual project director for the SNCC Legacy Project. Micha was a community curator fellow with Queer History Boston in 2021. So we're now going to have a moderated discussion. So my first question for our panelists is, do you remember the first time you saw The Watermelon Woman, and do you recall the impact it had on you?
Testing. Oh, I got it. Okay, great. I'll take this. Okay. Thank you all for sticking around and just being here. It's really wonderful to watch this movie in community, right, with so many folks. And so kudos to you all for making space and time to be present. The first time that I watched this movie was actually while I was in library science school. So it was really apropos as far as like reconciling for my desire to like preserve history, but seeing, some of the challenges to how history has been preserved and like the narratives that are sometimes fragmented or even missing from the archives. And so that was really exciting. Just to queer it I can remember one of my queer mask friends telling me about it. We're no longer friends, but it's beautiful to see the troubling and challenges of like relationships, because that's a real part of just being human, the messiness.
I do love how you threw that personal anecdote in there. So the first time I saw the movie was actually as an undergrad in a Black film course, and it was paired with Spike Lee's Bamboozled and Isaac Julian's Looking for Langston. So really thinking about what does it mean for Black filmmakers to reflect on the past when it isn't as well documented as, say, major Hollywood film productions. And one of the things that I did find very exciting when I first watched this in that kind of setting and in those conversations with other films is thinking about what does it mean for Black filmmakers to tell stories about themselves? What does it mean for you to excavate your own personal life? Because even in the course of my career, even getting my PhD, which hopefully, give it to me this year. Thank you. There still is this accusation of me-search, of if you are researching topics related to things about your own personal identity, it's not rigorous, it's not serious. So what does it mean for this film, The Watermelon Woman, to be so autobiographical while also being so rigorously historical and archival?
Thank you. So watching Cheryl's process of piecing together a history, we see that it's a labor of love, and there's this personal drive to uncover and share someone's story. So I'm wondering if there are ways in which your own projects and research have mirrored the search for the Watermelon Woman, and if this evokes any similar passion projects for you.
In my career, I had the opportunity to work at Mount Holyoke College, which is in Western Massachusetts. But one of their notable alum was Barbara Smith. I see some head shaking, so that's great. But part of the Combahee River Collective, was also a noted publisher, Homegirls, and that's in our backyard, right? That's shared history that we have, that we get to inherit as folks who live in the Boston metropolitan area. But while I was at Mount Holyoke, I got the opportunity to do an exhibit on her during her time at Mount Holyoke. And it was really wonderful, but it pushed me as far as how do you find someone in an archive, right? We had like alum folders, and hers was there, and it had some thickness to it, but it was often about post Mount Holyoke. But to look for her in the archive, I had to think about the different ways that the archive is organized. So looking in the African American Students Organization, looking in the president's papers and thinking about like how were Black students documented, particularly because it's the 1960s and they're thinking about a range of social issues. Also looking in the student newspapers. So it really pushed me not to limit myself into like this small folder that existed, but trying to find fragments of her throughout the archive, similar as, right, the Tulish character in this film does, right? And using multiple sources to kind of piece together. Now she gets that gold find at the end, but just thinking about multiple ways or entry points into finding someone is very much the practice of recovery.
And Barbara Smith's papers were just, they were just acquired by Schlesinger Research Library, so there is a position for Project Archivist for 2 years that is funded, so if you are interested in that kind of work, that's a role that you should probably apply for. I have several personal stories that I will condense into one, in that it seems like I continue to find these Black women who have their archives in their homes, and then I'm invited in to process them for their own posterity. Before this job, I was actually the Women's History Curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I ended up meeting the granddaughter of my dissertation subject, and she told me that her last surviving daughter, who was 100 at the time, had all of her mother's papers, all of her mother's personal effects. And so within 6 months of starting, I ended up acquiring a significant part of her personal collection that is now in the Smithsonian. And even though that was kind of like a pivotal moment of my career, I'm also still kind of skeptical of what does it mean for these institutions to give legitimacy to someone's story. A lot of my work has, like I said, been in personal Black women's archives, and a lot of times they were like, I want this process so that I can store it in my home. I don't have any interest in giving it to a repository. And when I went to grad school, I was telling people like, oh, this is the work that I was doing before I started my PhD, and they were like, you're the only one who has access to this, you need to write about her. You need to write about this woman. And I was like, well, it wasn't an extractive project. It was a labor of love. It was something that I'm interested in doing, but then there is still this idea that they don't exist, that they're not in a particular repository that researchers can access, then write articles, then write dissertations, then write books about them. So then how do we grapple with, I mean, you just said archives are created, they're not neutral. So how do we grapple with the idea of legitimacy being conferred on being in an archive? And then what is the work that we do, particularly in this kind of space or in an archive, where that's the only way to make this work legible, while also grappling with funding issues, while grappling with labor issues, and the idea that only certain kinds of repositories should be allowed to have major papers. I mean, even though it's great that Barbara Smith's papers are at Schlesinger Library, it's also, what does it mean for there to still be severely underfunded archives at HBCUs or in Black community organizations, and that will never have the opportunity to have these kinds of collections because they don't have the funding to actually care for them or to have staff on a regular basis. And so it's always just like this meta work of like, what am I doing? What am I creating access for? But then also, who is saying this is what it needs to be accessible?
Thank you. Yeah. So when we talk about silences in the archives and gaps in the historical record, what does that actually look like in practice? We're not talking about accidental absence, we're talking about something more active like erasure, distortion. So I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the gaps you've encountered, some of the systems that have created these gaps, and how you would think about, archives addressing these gaps in a way that is not extractive. Thank you.
You still gonna pass it back? Excellent. It's because I want to actually engage what you're saying. It's really beautiful. Gaps are going to exist in general, even with the best intentions. But I think I want to name much of my paid labor is actually in these institutions, particularly academic spaces. So I think that that's just important for me to acknowledge, just situationally. These gaps exist, curations, right? Archives, as you mentioned, are not neutral spaces. They are sites of power, right? They are sites that are supposed to codify memory, and they are parts of selection. When I think about queerness on top of that, though, just as Walker, before we watched it, remind us to, I forget the word that she used, that it's outdated. Queerness has come, not I want to say a long way, but it's shifted, the context changed. I can remember being younger and my mom thinking that someone's sexuality, when I was asking about, different family members, particularly my uncle, was his business. And so I just want to also remind us that when we're doing recovery work, archival research, there's a context always that we should try to situate ourselves into. And having a presence lens is helpful. It grounds us in the present, but there is limitations when we're looking in the past. I just want to kind of name that as we're thinking about, how does, they use the how does family show up in the archive? So it's definitely a space of curatorial choice, but I also think, I'm gonna actually stop there. I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna let you give it to you. Sorry, I just like that pause.
So your comments kind of sparked my memory of Darlene Clarkine, eminent Black women's historian, talking about the culture of dissemblance and that Black women were hiding deliberately parts of themselves. So that if we are thinking about recovery and you're saying, this is care work, so sometimes you don't always have to surface something hidden. You don't have to read across the grain of the archive if you figure out they didn't want people to know about this. They didn't actually record their lives in a way that says, well, I'm gonna excavate this part of their identity to highlight it. They're I don't want you to talk about that. And so it is a part of our judgment as archivists, as curators, as scholars to think about what it means to care about the subjects that we are researching and the subjects that we are collecting and archiving and displaying. But to bring it back to the question, so the exhibition Black Voices of the Revolution was a moment of reflecting on the silences in the archive about the Black presence here in Boston. So like I said, I was living in DC before I moved here, and when I came to Boston, I was just Phyllis Wheatley, Crispus Attucks, that's about it. That's all people talk about when they talk about Black Boston. And very quickly, I did learn that there was more to them than just he was assassinated, she was a poet. But it was also the idea that Boston tells a story that we are the good ones. We helped fight the revolution. Massachusetts was the first state to abolish slavery. We're great. And that's where the interrogation begins and ends. And so Black Voices was a moment to kind of push against that, of what is the story that Massachusetts, that Boston is telling about itself when you look at it through the lens of the Black community who lived here on the North Slope of Beacon Hill. And I always start off by saying I wish people would go in the direction that I intended them to encounter this exhibition, but they never do. But the correct way to move through the exhibition is to go to your right, because I have an entire panel showing my methodology. Because as I learned from reading Lonnie Bunch's book about the formation of Namak, there is still this idea of like, if it doesn't have papers, if there's no material culture, there's nothing, it doesn't exist. Black people have no history because we don't see anything. And so I really wanted to show how I got to these voices, which was finding where Black people are visible in the historical record. And one of the earliest parts that I saw, which I'm still kind of needing to sit with, is that a popular genre of literature in the early colonial period in New England were essentially Black people on death row writing their memoirs about, this is how I ended up in this situation where I'm about to be killed for this crime. And I was like, there's something to that being the earliest Black voice in this era, in this region. And what does it mean for being able to figure out what Black life might have been like because these people are going to be executed for a crime that maybe they didn't commit, or maybe they did because they were trying to self-emancipate themselves. And so there is still this question of how does finding these silences and these gaps do the work of making people reflect more, I guess, reflect more on the stories that they think they know and the things that they have been taught, and the kind of narratives that continue to persist, and particularly right now in this 250 period, America 250, as well as Massachusetts saying that we started in 1775. So Mass 250 started last year.
I knew you were going to help me bring that full circle. I mean, part of what your answer also really reminds me of, and what is so wonderfully depicted in the film, is the gaps and silences exist, but the push towards empathy and being more expansive in the storytelling. I think there's a way in which we can do narratives of talking about what the archive does not have, what it doesn't document. I think that criticality is important, but I think pushing ourselves to be more expansive on like how can we zone in on details is really critical. And so, you know, that's why the work that you do is so important as far as helping us as people who are museum goers to actually think critically or from a different angle about what we do have. And so just trying to push more of like empowerment as we're doing research for it to be, you know, do more possibilities for a more critical, more expansive, more fulsome reading that's there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm also wondering, when you were thinking about imagining past, like, so Faye Richards, the Watermelon Woman, is ultimately a fabrication, but, you know, so how can we use imagination in a way to address, like, to tell historical narratives, and then who do you think should be using that imaginative history as a tool, and how do you think it's effective and meaningful, or ineffective otherwise?
Right on. Yeah, let's use imagination responsibly, right? Only because, right, she is a fabrication and she's rooted in history. I mean, even looking at some of the inspirations for her, she's grounded, in a Hattie McDaniels, right? So she is, a imaginative figure who's standing in the gaps, and it's believable that she's real, right? There's so much nuance and so much possibility in who she's depicted and like the different layers of herself and the related and relationships. And so I think as we're, you know, finding scraps to imagine the past or recover, just doing so with responsible ethics, right? And so even doing this, it's not that it's just like the Watermelon Woman, right? Even the name of it, I was telling my mom, she was like, oh, I don't like the title of that. I was like, I understand. And let's move, like, that's actually a part of like the unpacking and the interrogation. Like, what does it mean to be uncredited, untitled, unnamed in archives, right? In that recovery piece. And so I think the research around even this fictionalized character is super important, and so I want to just like encourage, as we're thinking creatively, to make sure that we have good background, good context, and good reference points to think through it. I'm
gonna have to shout out Sadia Hartman and Critical Fabulation. As a deliberate method of doing that, of using imagination to fill in the archival gaps. Venus in Two Axes is an article that I was introduced to in undergrad, which is shocking because it is a very critical methodology that sometimes you don't really understand what you're reading until years later and you're actually doing the work. But I do think that thinking about how the Watermelon Woman is an amalgamation of so many Black women who were uncredited. So one of my old hobbies, so I'm also kind of strange in that I will have one hobby, be obsessed with it, and then I'm done with it. So about 10 years ago, I was obsessed with old Hollywood films from the 1920s to the 1960s. And there was a period where I was like, well, there's so many people that I keep seeing in all of these films, and every time you look at the credits, they're uncredited. And this was also back in the day when Internet Movie Database was actually good because you could fight with people in the message boards before they got rid of them. So there were, message boards for just about every single actor or director or anybody listed in a film. And it was often exciting to realize that some of these uncredited people would have someone who had left a message like 10 years before saying, oh yeah, this is my grandmother. This was my aunt or whatever, I knew who this was. So that kind of excavation to kind of extrapolate what a fictionalized person who stands in for real people, you saw that method in this movie. It wasn't a mystery of how she was building the story. So I do like to think that this is kind of a Saidiya Hartman before everyone started realizing what critical fabulation was.
Thank you. Gosh, I want to keep listening to you and asking more questions, but we're nearing the end, so I have to just ask a final question, and it's hard to pick, but I guess I will go with, if someone in the audience wanted to start preserving their own community's history tomorrow, what's one place they could begin? And if you want to tie that into, I think, your idea of what archives of the future should look like and do, and yeah, that would be great.
All right, and I might have to be pass back, a little pass back and forth for a second.
Do you want the mic?
No, I'm good. Well, I mean, the exciting part about being alive right now in the 21st century is that each of us have the opportunity to be documentarians. Right, like having access to an archive in the past, or having records of yourself, having a camera at one point was very expensive, right? Having access to ink and paper was very expensive, but right now we all have, not we all, I don't want to make assumptions, but many of us, we have opportunities, right? Whether that's on a piece of paper, whether that's with your phone, and looking there, like thinking about yourself. There's so much that I think is challenging right now, particularly thinking about social media and performance of self. What do you put online? There's a whole lot of ways that my mind just breaks down personally thinking about that, but thinking about what do you want to be remembered as? What is important to you? Who is important to you? What do you have that evidences that or documents that? And you can start your own collection now. You can record conversations with friends. You can record conversations with your family. You can take pictures of obscure things. You can organize them in your own kind of ways on your computer or on your phone. There's many opportunities, and I think just thinking about what's important to you and where do you want to start. So that's very open-ended. Who knows what the future will hold and all the possibilities and the scariness of AI and how that might get a little bit more challenging. But all that to say is you can keep a diary. I mean, there's many ways that you as an individual are important. The communities that you're a part of are important. And maybe one day your material might be in an archive, but perhaps maybe you pass it off to queer family. There's many possibilities of self-making, so that's one of my thoughts.
I'm not gonna get too in the weeds because I do this every day. And I was actually having a conversation with someone where I was like, we cannot take this because we cannot care for this. So BPL, Boston Public Library, they actually have an oral history pack. like a backpack that you can borrow, and you can record oral histories with people. And they're great because they have a lot of great workshops. The staff is amazing. So that's one way to archive yourself, your community. The other thing that I would say is, like my earlier comments about repositories lending legitimacy on someone's story. So I do think that like Queer History Boston is a great organization in that it is mediating that moment where you're like, well, where should my story be held? Sometimes community archives can be better because you have more access to them. If you want to go to the Library of Congress, there's a huge little process that you have to go through, and then you have to get your picture taken, you have to get an ID, then you have to leave your backpack in a locker, and you can only use, well, you should only use pencil and paper, but it is like this huge process when you are in a traditional archive. And sometimes, I mean, even though the movie made me scream when she was just dumping all those boxes out, I was like, don't do that. Sometimes, that kind of experience is better because you can just get in the weeds and you don't have to worry about someone looking at you, glaring at you, and telling you your time's up and you need to get out. But then there are uses for traditional institutions. Like I am thinking right now about a colleague, Jija, who's working with the Reckoning Project at Northeastern, because even though I've heard from several people who are from Lower Roxbury and Roxbury, there is still Northeastern trying to have some kind of form of reparations for their encroachment upon those neighborhoods and the gentrification that has come with the university's expansion. But sometimes those kinds of projects are important for saying, like, this is not going to erase the historical record and the official record of our presence here in this neighborhood.
All right. Do we have time for a Q&A? Okay. All right, we will do a brief Q&A. Okay.
Thank y'all so much for your words. And I guess one question I have is, I've noticed sometimes people will label a historical figure gay, lesbian, maybe even black, when that's not a term they would have even used to describe themselves. Do you ever have to catch yourself from doing that? And like, how do you kind of connect that kind of sense of where their identity was with today's maybe terms and concepts?
Here, pass it over to me. So this is something about the weeds. So metadata, that is how we're capturing lives. And one of the things that I was appreciative of when I was at the Smithsonian was that Namak was adamant about creating their own cataloging system to capture Black life in the way that the museum wanted to interpret Black people. And that was also shocking to me because then I started working with someone at the National Museum of American History, and they said that they had to go in and type in every single word that could be used to describe a Black person because the museum used all of them across its history. And so it is a moment of like, what does it mean to keep those phrases and that terminology in the metadata? And then what does it mean for a newer institution to say, no, this is how we're going to capture Black life and Black people in our cataloging process. So, it is complex and complicated, mostly based on the institution's priorities and the curatorial lens that they are thinking through about how they're gonna describe their collections. And I also say, like, even here, I've been having these conversations about like, well, I wouldn't have described that in that way, but that is how someone chose to do so 10, 15 years ago, and I have to keep that while also still figuring out how to update the records and make it a little bit more, I wouldn't say accurate, but like how I feel like this museum should be interpreting Black people and their lives.
Yeah, and I think, just to add to that, I think coming to terms with, as queer people, I know self-definition is important, and there's limitations to language. And, right, we don't know the future. Even yesterday, visiting Queer History Boston and talking about Polly Murray, I get kind of nervous in my head of how do I refer to her, that right, knowing that there is complexity, and even when I think about myself and my possible legibility or illegibility in the future. So I just want to hold space that, again, we're living in a present tense time and thinking about like the context in which someone lives in, but also just the imperfectness of language and how language changes over time. Like we were looking yesterday and thinking about the search term that you were looking for folks who were disrupting gender or being gender transgressive, right? Not to label them, and the kinds of words that were associated, whether that was like women impersonating. We don't know the interiority, particularly their feelings, but we do know that they were transgressing gender norms, and thus we can put them into a gender queerish, a gender, a transgender category, but that's just still imperfect. So I think just thinking broadly in broad strokes, right? Like what does like butch lesbian look like and the versus like trans, like it's actually just all messy, and we can do this conflating and putting it all, like making them, apples to apples, when really there's just like a diversity of experience, and thinking through that just takes a certain kind of, I think, capaciousness and honestly a discomfort, right? Because we can't neatly box things sometimes, and so all that to say is there's limitations.
Polymere, I have to talk about Polymere too, because we did have that conversation. So Angela Thorpe is executive director of the Polymere Center in North Carolina, and we borrowed a book for the exhibition that I co-curated at the Smithsonian, and she was just like, how are you describing Polymere? And even though all the metadata for the Mok's collections were she, her pronouns, new scholarship is non-binary, trans possibly, and so when I was writing that label, I was just gonna say Polymere, no pronouns at all. So that's also a decision that I chose to make despite my colleagues being like, well, that's not what it says in our metadata.
Go ahead.
Outside of archival, I think there's a big phenomenon changing within research and how it's perceived, especially of non-Western, non-white groups. In 50 years, how do you think how we perceive research and how it's done, especially by people of that group? And then also, as we saw in the movie, when a cis white person tries to make an understanding or peer review of Black studies, even if you go back to the first initials in the 1960s, these are still technically new genres of academia. So how do you think we're adapting the research, especially as you complete your PhD, right? And then having it peer reviewed in a notoriously white ivory tower space. How are we adapting for the research to be acceptable, but then also remaining the standard when it's being peer reviewed, saying, hey, you can't actually peer review this because you don't even read enough to have context in the situation.
I'm just gonna say thank you for saying that. Because sometimes you can't get around reviewer number 2 where they're just like, no, this is all bad, and you're like, I don't care about what you have to say. It is important to note that like Black studies, queer studies, women's studies, these are all pretty brand new disciplines in the academy that are now currently under attack in so many institutions, preemptively or actually being directly attacked by this administration. And so it does mean like, what are we doing today to codify what was happening, but then also grappling again with the fact that Black studies, queer studies, women's studies, they were never meant to be institutionalized. They were developed specifically to counteract the disciplines of history, of anthropology, political science that said gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, class has nothing to do with these topics. So I do think that, even though I am institutionalized because I am in a history department, I have also thought about like where are the subversive ways to get around that, and that's kind of why I would be working in museums as well, even though museums and public history is its own field with its own terminology and its own kinds of ways of trying to be institutionalized. So, spaces like this and honestly being able to talk beyond what I have written on paper is another way of making that work legible in ways that sometimes the academy doesn't privilege or give you props for. So like this is kind of why I do a lot of talks, because sometimes if you're just reading my work, it is meant for a particular audience that is meant to say you are legitimate, but then in the space like this, it is going around that.
Up here? Okay, we're coming up.
I mean, I don't want to knock here.
I think the teeth is on the other way.
Hi, I think my question is sort of a follow-up on that. So if I remember, this movie was permitted through a grant through the NEA, and then also crowdfunded. And so I guess I find some tension in this, because to some degree, this was in the early 90s where this film was granted by the NEA, heavily protested and defended. And now we're in a moment where NEA grants and most grants have completely disappeared around this subject area. And so I guess, how do you contend with the illusion of potential progress as we're sort of defining this in this moment, right? Because the reason that some of those stills of, the mammy figure are that way is because she couldn't afford to reproduce some of that archival material. And so I guess what I'm asking is, materially, how do we sort of look at this moment where we are, and sort of how we maybe are thinking about progress as it might relate to some of these disciplines, and how we sort of talk about them in community? Sorry, my bad.
Good luck.
I mean, those are the questions that the Academy is having about itself after having thought that this stuff would exist forever. I had several friends whose NEH grants for their research were canceled last year. And they're newly tenure track professors who now are thinking, well, what does it mean for me to not be able to meet these benchmarks to get tenure, because all of this funding has been pulled, or my research is seen as unpatriotic or not fitting into the national standards of what scholarship should be. I don't have any questions or any answers, because it's like, we never thought we would be in this position, and we don't know where we're gonna end up. I mean, there is a limit to how much philanthropy can fill in the gaps for this funding that has been pulled from so many institutions, so many researchers, so many filmmakers. There is so much crowdsourcing that we can do. So it is kind of like, what do we do now in this moment to think about what we're doing now?
Yeah.
And I think I'm also hearing, as part of your question, the tension between what grant funding, and I have an unsatisfactory answer in that it's always been messy, right? If you look to Zora Neale Hurston and her fights with Langston Hughes, it had to do with sharing a benefactor and thinking about right? So just that tension is always going to exist under capitalism, sadly. So unsatisfactory for us all.
Hello there. My question's a little different. If, in using our imagination, if there was a sequel to this movie, what would you want from it? What would it look like, if you have an idea? Also love the red nails.
A sequel. Well, I'm gonna just be selfish for just one moment. One of the questions we also were thinking about was what stood out to you? The relationship with the mom. I'm always into familial relationships. I'm intrigued by the concept that her mom was, this person was familiar to her, Faye Richards, right? Yeah. She had a context point, even though we don't know much about her mom, other than that she's a keeper of things. So I would love more treatment, part 2, more treatment, or was her mom in those spaces? What does that mean for her mom to be in family spaces, right? Queer spaces. And her mom's comfort, right? She did make an off-putting comment, but I think that also shows for me my experience of, contending with, that was shady, like kind of messy, but also it's multi-contextual, it's multi-layered. So I think, I don't know. Also, does their friendship repair? I don't know. I mean, so many things. I'm just like, oh, where does that go? I don't know. So I'm not a good filmmaker, obviously, and I just like to pontificate. But thank you for that question.
Even though, I was a child in the 90s, it is weird to think about so many people finding it to be history. You're like, oh wow, TVs and with the back and a phone with the cord, and I'm like, oh, that's what I remember growing up. Yeah, exactly. I know, having to call people and be like, I hope you show up. You can't text them and say, where are you? Honestly, I always think about how this early to mid 90s period is also in the shadow of the AIDS pandemic. And when she had, in the credits, I found that it was very, very clever to roll the story through the credits as the movie was ending. And so I was just Googling the names and just thinking about how many Black creatives, queer creatives were lost in this period. And also Philadelphia being an epicenter, still kind of an epicenter of queer and Black and brown communities. My father, his family is from Philly. And so I was like, oh yeah, I've been in all of these places. A lot of that looked very familiar to me. But 30 years later, what is Philadelphia? What is Black Philadelphia now? Particularly now, as everybody is also thinking about the MOVE bombing and a lot of the ways that has affected how Philadelphia has talked about itself, how people have moved in those spaces. But I think that would be my sequel of what does it look like? What does that story look like 30 years later?
And we have one more question. I think we're getting towards the end of our time. So is this okay if this is our last question? Okay, here you go.
Thank you. So I wanted to take us back to oral histories and the function and reliance upon oral histories and living memory in the movie. So we see oral histories and the conversations that Cheryl has as a real space of opportunity. So both a treasure trove and then also a space of friction for Cheryl. And so I think that the movie asks of us, what do we do when the story that we think we're going to tell at the outset of doing our research comes into contact and friction with the life that is lived and the person that we want to share and keep their memories of. What do we do? And how do we, as memory keepers ourselves, do our best to care for the person that is on the other side of the story that we're now researching?
Yes, I love oral histories. And I think what oral histories do really well is tell you what the meaning making people have associated with events or times, right? You don't go to oral histories to get the exact time of day, the date, right, those kind of specificities. I find that I'm doing oral histories to really understand the context, the meaning, the associates of meaning making people are making with their lived experiences. And I think that those are important forms of recovery, right? Oftentimes, when archives don't feel like they have physical collections of material or evidence of people outside of just names, one of the first things that they'll do is do an oral history project. And I think oral histories are puzzle pieces, right? Because there's oftentimes where I'm listening to oral history, I'm like, man, that was great. Also, I wish they would have asked this question, but this is what I have. So I guess I'm just saying that oral histories are definitely a tool, and there's limitations and also possibilities with them.
I love when you have to look at an oral history and you're like, yeah, I wish they had asked those questions. Particularly when you're reading the transcripts, because I have worked with transcripts a lot, because, again, what does it mean to institutionalize something that's never meant to be institutionalized? I would also say that oral history is also a field in and of itself. Even though I'm a field and discipline skeptic, there is a benefit of having a body of literature of practitioners who are thinking carefully and critically about this practice. So there are several books that talk about how to take care of the subject and also take care of yourself. Because sometimes something that comes up might be traumatic and you're re-traumatizing the person who's retelling it, but then you also are possibly traumatizing yourself. So there is a method to doing oral history that is deeply rooted in caring for the subject as well as yourself while you're recording these stories. I also think that oral history, this is another thing, like I said, I'm involved in a lot of things right now. So I'm working with 12 Baptist Church on their histories, because there are several. And by the way, I was joking, I was like, we're the original church. So basically 12 Baptist Church congregation split from the Meeting House congregation in the 19th century because they thought, you all aren't radical enough, but they moved next door. So the building that's next door is where they moved to. But now they're in Roxbury. But when we've been having like these liberation lunches after the service every Sunday, and people are just wanting to talk. We've given them questions, we're trying to guide the conversation, but people are like, someone is listening to me now. Someone gets to hear me tell what it was like 15 years ago. And so this is also an opportunity to just give people who often Black women, elderly Black women who have never had the opportunity to just talk and have people sit and listen to them and hear their experience. Some of the stuff they've been saying has been a little wild, but I was like, let's just give them the table and let it all out, because it's obviously been bottled up in them for a very long time. So that's also where oral history and the practice of giving people the ability to tell their stories about themselves is also kind of therapeutic.
All right, yeah, and I know the BPL is having some trainings about doing oral histories with four trainings, okay, with sensitive subjects, talking about how to navigate trauma and things like that. So shout out to the BPL. But thank you both so much, Angela and Micah, and to the museum for doing this collaboration, and thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.